All right. So if you're not instantly aware of what my title means, hopefully you will by the time we're done with this teaching. And so here's what I want to dig into today: synthesizing the Ten Commandment. All right, what in the world does synthesizing something mean? All right, well, essentially it's looking at many things tangential to it, right? Cause and effect. We're talking about inception and progression of it, looking for principles that might define it. But I think the easiest way I think we could do that is that if we do these things that are listed here, we'll understand it better, how important it is, and then hopefully how to apply it throughout our lives. We can compare it to the other nine. We can analyze its violations. Covetousness is more or less defined as maybe a thought crime. So seeing its violations can sometimes be tricky. They're not quite so evident. And then we can look at its second order effects and discuss historical and modern applications and events. All right, so then if we can hopefully walk away with a more rounded understanding of why a commandment, which is against something with no initial outward observable physical manifestations, why this would be so important. So, as I mentioned already, the 10th commandment is essentially a thought crime, and so much so a thought crime that Paul says he would not have known it was a sin unless the Torah had said so. And my evidence for that is Romans 7, verse 7, which says, well, what shall we say then? Is the law sin? Certainly not. On the contrary, I would not have known sin except through the law, for I would have not have known covetousness unless the law had said, you shall not covet. And this is not said about any other commandment. So not coveting is a little bit different. And obviously, it's important because it's made the top 10. All right. Tradition states that when you read Exodus chapter 20 and you start in verse 1, you should read through all the commandments together. I do believe there's a point for that tradition, but I don't think it's always completely necessary. And so instead of reading through all this right now to save time, let's put that to the side. We are going to look at all of them in a more simplified format going forward. So if you want to read through all of them, you can pause this and read through all of them. All right. Before we really get into it, in case you're not aware, there's multiple traditions of outlining the Ten Commandments. And just in case you come from the Catholic tradition and you have their understanding of the Ten Commandments, I'll let you know right up front, I disagree with their breakdown of the Ten Commandments just outright. I don't agree. All right, one of the most glaring issues is that they replace the Sabbath when they list out what we see as the fourth commandment. They have it as the third commandment and they call it the Lord's Day, which they do believe in the Sabbath. They believe in the Sabbath in the same way that most Hebrew roots or Messianics believe in the Sabbath, that God outlined the Sabbath as starting Friday at sunset, ending Saturday at sunset. But they reject it outright and therefore replace it in the Ten Commandments with the terminology the Lord's Day, which is both adding and taking away from the words of Yah. The other thing that you'll notice is that they completely remove what the Protestants have defined as the second commandment, which is not making any graven images. And, let's face it, the Catholics love their graven images. So they have to take that one out to, I guess, help appease their conscience in some way. And because they take it out to still get to 10, they have to split the 10th commandment into two parts to make it both the ninth and the 10th commandment. All right, where they have number 9 as you shall not covet your neighbor's wife, and number 10 as you shall not covet your neighbor's possessions. All right, now it's worth noting that the Jews don't have the graven image in part as their or part of their second commandment in the summary version, but they do have that and believe the second commandment sums that up. So much so that they're actually far more cautious against graven images than even the Protestants are. And essentially, I would say the Jews and the Protestants are very similar in what they see falling under both the first and the second commandment. Now, I would say that I slightly favor the Jewish version of the second commandment, and I also really appreciate that they have the first commandment as I am the Lord your God, or Yah, your Elohim. All right. Now, my title mentioned the last commandment, and that's really going to be my focus today. So let's begin by defining some terms. All right. First, I will say that I may use the terms envy and covetousness interchangeably. Now, they aren't exactly the same, all right, but I do think that there's enough overlap that you almost never have one without the other, especially by the time you get to covetousness, you have exceeded the definition of envy. All right, but there is a third term that I want to define, which I don't have up here, which is desire. All right, now in the progression to covetousness, it always starts with desire. But desire can be tricky because desire can be both good or bad. It doesn't necessarily mean because you desire something that it's going to develop into sin, right? But it does have what I kind of view as a litmus test, all right? And that test is this: is what you desire something you have a right to? Is it something you have a legitimate claim on? All right. For instance, I desire my wife. All right. We have a covenant together. In this covenant, we say we will only desire each other. And so, therefore, we have this claim upon each other. Now, if I transfer that desire to someone else's wife or another woman, I have no claim to those people. All right. And I would have left the area or the confines of righteous desire. So desire is both good or bad based on the context. All right, so now let's look at the definition of envy. All right, this says envy is an emotion that arises when a person lacks another's superior quality, achievement, or possession and either desires it or wishes that the other lacked it. It's often associated with feelings of resentment or discontent. And I think it kind of can get summed up in these two phrases here, which is wanting what someone else has and feeling bad because they have it and you don't. And I think a lot of times this could be the point of sin. All right. And if this is fostered even in the slightest, it's almost always going to lead into covetousness. All right. So the next thing is covetousness. This is perhaps a stronger version of envy, and I think it's where the person that has these thoughts or ideas starts thinking of the object of the envious desire in a possessive frame of mind. All right, let's look at that definition. Covetousness is defined as an intense or excessive desire to possess something, especially something that belongs to someone else. It often refers to material wealth, possessions, or status. So I think it can be summed up in these two things, right? Strong desire, it goes beyond simple wanting, it's a deep craving. And then possessiveness, this is a defining characteristic. It often involves wanting to own or take what someone else has. So, just to recap, desire is based on context, whether it's good or bad. Envy and covetousness don't necessarily have to do with material items. Covetousness, by definition, is an adulterated desire that has become essentially purely evil in nature. So the main difference is that envy is discontent because another person has something they believe should be theirs or they strongly desire. Then covetousness starts to figure out this way to make possessing that object a reality. All right, but the interesting thing is that both of these things listed here, envy and covetousness, are still in the realm of thought crimes. They haven't hurt anyone yet. You may not even know that they've happened because at this stage, they've only occurred in the mind, or you could say the heart, right? You could say they're heart crimes, not thought crimes. But I think the term thought crime has this better ring to it. Um, and I also believe that when scripture speaks of the heart, it's often referring to the mind. It says, I can't remember exactly where, but as a man thinks in his heart, so is he, right? So thinking in that verse occurs in the heart. And um, let's ask this question, right? So is this the only commandment where a violation of it is simply a thought crime? All right, and I think it's not. Let's look back at all 10 and see if any others are thought crimes. All right. For this exercise, I think let's go ahead and use the Jewish version. All right, so most of these are going to be pretty obvious if they've been transgressed, right? In murder, there's a dead body on the scene, right? Stealing, uh, you have items, you have locations. Now something is missing that belonged to someone. All right, so we're asking the question of which ones may occur in the heart or the mind. And I think five is a potential option here, right? It may not be obvious that your heart doesn't honor your father or mother. I also think that number one, Yah is your one and only God. All right. So maybe we do consider five as a potential thought crime, but at least seven of these um, aren't transgressed according to the words here until something physically happened or a 24-hour period occurred in which something didn't happen, right? Speaking of remembering the Sabbath, right? If you go that 24 hours and there's no obvious remembrance or any action that's taken to show that the Sabbath is remembered, then it's been transgressed and that's observable, all right? Hopefully we can have some level of agreement on that. And yes, I will say that Yeshua did say that for several of these, his standard is much higher. In other words, for number seven, even looking at a woman with lust was adultery in the heart, and that hate of a brother was like murder in the heart. However, I think these statements are more of a warning um, for a way to avoid the transgression and not the level at which the judgment occurs. All right. But the first command, I've known several people throughout my life that hate God. They hate him. And you wouldn't know this really in the slightest unless you ask them. You enter into a conversation, they start, spewing their vileness about God. And I've known some very caring people that I would not have known that they were atheist, they were witches, they were druid or pagans. You know, I would have no idea these people don't love Yah as their one and only God until the discussion about their beliefs occurred. So, hopefully we're at the point where we can agree that one 5, and 10 are probably the only three potential thought crimes. And really, what I want to do is set aside number 5 and only think about 1 and 10, because I think these become fairly relevant in something that Yeshua says. All right, and what does he say? All right, he says this. Now, this is a response that he gives when he's asked which is the greatest commandment. This is in Matthew 22. All right, in verse 36, they say, Master, which is the greatest commandment in the law? And Jesus said unto them, Thou shalt love the Lord thy God with all thy heart, with all thy soul, and with all thy mind. This is the first and great commandment, and the second is like unto it. Thou shalt love thy neighbor as thyself. On these two commandments hang all the law and the prophets. You know, something interesting is that for the great commandment, Yeshua uses the second phrase in the Shema. And he calls this the first commandment. All right, in the Shema, this is well after the Ten Commandments, but he says it's the first. So let's ask, does this relate to the first commandment on the first tablet? And so really my question is, how does the greatest commandment and the second greatest commandment relate to the two commands, or relate to the 10 commands given on the two tablets? So let's re-look at the 10 commands and see how they might fit within the two great commands. And what I've intended to do here is summarize each command into the fewest words possible. And I believe that the first command, whether you say it the Jewish way or the Protestant way, I have this combined summary in spot 1 here, where me only means no other gods, which combines the Jewish and the Protestant ideas as well. All right, so would my question of which of the 10 commands does the Shema, which Yeshua said is the greatest command, command 1, or from the Protestant perspective, 1 and 2, does it line up there, right? And I think it's especially easy to see that with the phrasing that we at Israel use for the Shema, which is the most exact translation to the Hebrew words, which says, Hear, O Israel, Yahweh your Elohim, Yahweh alone. Love Yahweh your Elohim, etc. It goes on, right? So the phrasing identifies who exactly the God is, and it also cements exclusivity as the primary element that he requires going forward, right? Doesn't it? I mean, hopefully you can see that. So which of the 10 is the best summary of the Shema, which Yeshua said is the greatest command? I think it's clearly identifiable in number 1. All right, so I want to get into some of the potential relationships between the commandments, see if we can make a connection between the 10 commandments, or from the 10 commandments to that second great command that Yeshua mentioned. All right. I think the easiest way to relate the commands is by which tablet they're on. And I think if you did that, you might come up with something like this. Now, I know what your gut instinct says, which is, hey, wait a minute, number 5 isn't a God-focused command. It seems to me like it's a people-focused command. But is it though? I think it can be both, potentially, because this command comes from Yah, who created you with a particular father and mother that you're born to. And I think it's an extension of your honor to God, the one that created you and gave you the assignment of the father and mother. All right, now number 5 is such an interesting commandment, right? It comes with the promise, right? That your days will be long in the land, and it's just not quite as neatly assignable, and it's a little bit harder to categorize than the other ones. So maybe it's debatable, but like I said, let's not get distracted. Let's leave 5 out of it for now. All right. What I'm trying to get to is that if loving Yah is the key or the inspiration for the first five, or the first four, if you disagree about number five, is there a key or an inspiration on the second tablet for the second five? One might could think of it um, like this. Perhaps if you had 1 through 10 in a straight line, like they're strung on a rope. You grab the bottom end where 10 is, and you hold it up to where the rope is drooping down, but it's split in the middle. Now you have two top ends of the rope. And on one side, you have 1 through 5, and on the other side, you have 10 through 6, right? And my point to this is that these are both heart oriented commands. All right. And I think that they play an instrumental part in the ones that now fall below them. And you can kind of test the theory, right, about them being heart oriented commands that inspire the ones below them by asking a simple question. If I keep this one, will it ensure, or at least heavily contribute to me keeping the others? And we could test it with between the commands on the first tablet. So we could ask, hey, if I remember the Shabbat, will that ensure I won't create or worship graven images? I don't think you could say that they have a one-to-one correlation there, right? You could remember the Shabbat, set it aside, and bring graven images into it. I think certainly Israel may have been doing that at certain times. All right. But I think you could say, hey, if I love Yah, I'm not going to make any graven images. I'm not going to misrepresent him. I'm not going to forget his Shabbat. You can actually go all the way through both tablets and say, hey, this one overarching law ties all the laws together. And I believe that's why it said over and over and over again, if you love me, you will keep my commandments. All right, but just for fun, let's try this on the second tablet. So we could ask about number 7 here, which if I don't commit adultery, will that ensure I don't lie about my neighbor? I don't think one is really contingent on the other between those. What about if I don't steal, will that ensure I don't commit adultery? No. Now you could say if I don't steal, will that ensure I don't commit murder? You could do either or without doing the other, although murder and theft do go very well together a lot. All right, but now let's try this with number 10 to 9 to 8 to 7 to 6. If I don't covet my neighbor's wife, possessions, positions, things, will I lie about them? Well, actually, envy is the number one cause, I think, of bearing false witness. All right, how about if I don't covet my neighbor's all those things, all my neighbor's stuff and possessions, will I steal from them? That plays a pretty big part in theft. If I don't covet my neighbor's stuff, will I take their wife or daughters inappropriately? I don't think you will, right? If I don't covet my neighbor's stuff, will I murder them? I think there's a giant correlation between those two. And actually, between all of these on the second tablet and not coveting. Now, I know what you're thinking. Envy could be a factor in 4 of these, especially, but it doesn't have to be a factor, especially in murder, right? Maybe lying about the neighbor as well, but the adultery one is very clear cut. I think it always starts with a desire that has left righteous confines. Stealing, I think, typically starts with a desire for something you don't have a right to. But murder and bearing false witness against a neighbor could come from a situation where wanting something that doesn't belong to you is not the biggest factor. I think it's probably true because of the anger factor, which is kind of a wild card factor here, which includes other elements like, resentment and hatred. And it doesn't always come from covetousness, but I do believe covetousness is a larger cause of murder than anger, at least as far as the sheer body count. And I'll provide some evidence for that here a little later on. Now, this is sort of getting back to the root of my title, right? If we love Yah, we see that we will start lining up with the commandments on the first tablet. And if we love our neighbor, and we start with not coveting, we begin to line up with the commandments on the second tablet. Now, you cannot love your neighbor and also want their stuff. Or, sorry, you can, how am I going to put this? All right, if you love your neighbor, you're not also going to want their stuff. All right. Once you start thinking about their stuff, their wife, their position, whatever, right? That person becomes less sovereign in your mind, and that begins leading to violations of theft, adultery, murder, slander, etc. All right, but I want to come back to this after a look at envy as a tool, right? The inducement of envy as it's seen in many stories, actually, throughout Scripture. So, this is a look at the very first violation, all right? And this is Genesis 3, starting verse 6 here. When the woman saw that the tree was good for food, that it was pleasant to the eyes, a tree to be desired to make one wise, she took of the fruit thereof and did eat, and gave also to her husband with her, and he did eat. Now, we often think of this first violation of the law was Eve eating something forbidden. But that's actually the second manifested violation. The first manifested violation was the theft of the fruit because she knew it was not hers to take. She had strict instructions not to take it. All right, but the actual first violation was the way that she thought about the fruit. Right? If it's obviously not hers, now remember, God had said, I've given you every tree and plant for food except this tree, the tree of knowledge of good and evil. So it's not being shared with her at all, right? And so thinking about taking it, because she had been sold this lie that it would make her equal to God, and desiring the fruit and the position of being equal to God was the first violation because neither belonged to her. All right, and we can kind of see that when we look at a little bit deeper into some of these words. Now, there are three phrases in here that really uncover the progression that Eve took until she coveted it. All right, the first is that she saw that the tree was good for food. Food meaning, hey, it could apply to her. It's something possible to be consumed by her, right? Next, she noticed its beauty. It had this visual appeal that can produce desire. And I really like mangoes. In my opinion, mangoes, they're one of the most beautiful fruit out there. And because I know it's also the most delicious fruit, I go into the supermarket, I may have to avert my eyes from looking at mangoes. Of course, that's just a little bit of humor. All right, but this third phrase in here, all right, this is where she started getting into trouble. It had an attribute that was off limits to her. And it's the very reason she couldn't have it because the knowledge that it unlocked was reserved for Yah alone. All right. And that forbidden wisdom, which was off limits, was also the reason she desired it. Right. She wanted it because it was something she could use for food. It had the visual appeal and it unlocked forbidden knowledge or wisdom. All right. And so if you apply the Ten Commandments retroactively, the first sin would not be eating the fruit, it would not be taking the fruit. The first sin would have been desiring another sovereign being's possession, right? And the theft and eating of something forbidden were subsequent sins brought on by her covetousness. All right, and if you look at most sin in the Bible, you'll notice a pattern of covetousness and then a follow on sin or sins, which in many instances are adultery, murder, theft, lying about the neighbor. And let's go ahead and take a look at one of the first ones of those that really encompasses a lot. All right, and this is from 1 Kings 21. And it came to pass after these things that Naboth the Jezreelite had a vineyard which was in Jezreel, next to the palace of Ahab, king of Samaria. So Ahab spoke to Naboth, saying, give me your vineyard, so that I may have it for a vegetable garden, because it is near, next to my house, and for it I will give you a vineyard better than it. Or, if it seems good to you, I will give you its worth in money. But Naboth said to Ahab, the Lord forbid that I should give the inheritance of my fathers to you. So Ahab went into his house sullen and displeased because of the word which Naboth the Jezreelite had spoken to him. For he had said, I will not give you the inheritance of my fathers. And he lay down on his bed, and he turned away his face, and he would eat no food. But Jezebel his wife came to him and said to him, why is your spirit so sullen that you eat no food? And he said to her, because I've spoken to Naboth the Jezreelite, and said to him, give me your vineyard for money, or else if it pleases you, I will give you another vineyard for it. And he answered, I will not give you my vineyard. Then Jezebel his wife said to him, you now exercise authority over Israel. Arise, eat food, and let your heart be cheerful. I will give you the vineyard of Naboth the Jezreelite. Continuing on. And she wrote letters in Ahab's name and sealed them with a seal and sent the letters to the elders and the nobles who were dwelling in the city with Naboth. And she wrote in the letters saying, proclaim a fast and seat Naboth with high honor among the people, and seat 2 men, scoundrels, before him to bear witness against him, saying, you have blasphemed God and the king, and then take him out and stone him that he may die. So the men of his city, the elders and the nobles who were inhabitants of his city, did as Jezebel had sent to them. And it was written in the letters which she had sent to them. And they proclaimed a fast and seated Naboth with high honor among the people. And 2 men, scoundrels, came in and they sat before him. And the scoundrels witnessed against him and said against Naboth in the presence of the people, saying, Naboth has blasphemed God and the king. And then they took him outside the city and they stoned him with stones that he died. And they sent to Jezebel, saying, Naboth has been stoned and is dead. Now, I don't know how you feel when you hear this story, but this story particularly infuriates me. A noble man like Naboth, being lied against, murdered, having his inheritance of his father stolen. But I think it clearly shows the consequences of covetousness. Right? It started with breaking the 10th commandment. Right? Ahab coveted what Naboth had. Right? And then it breaks the 9th commandment, and then the 6th commandment, and then the 8th commandment. And the only thing they didn't do, because of Ahab's covetousness, was commit adultery. Right? So Ahab coveted the possession of another sovereign being. His evil wife perpetrated the theft through bearing false witness against Naboth to effect his murder and complete the theft to satisfy the coveting of her husband. Okay, well, it worked out that coveting came first here. And that doesn't always mean coveting is the initial sin leading to a violation of the command to love your neighbor. But let's look at another one, all right? And I'll just give you the parable of this one. There was an exceedingly rich man that took his poor neighbor's only beloved little lamb. And of course, if you know the story of uh, David and Samuel, then you know exactly that I am talking about, sorry, not Samuel, of Nathan, the prophet. This is the story that Nathan the prophet gave to David to expose the theft, adultery, murder, and covetousness that David had done. But let's take a quick look at how it started. 2 Samuel chapter 11. Then it happened one evening that David arose from his bed and he walked on the roof of the king's house. And from the roof he saw a woman bathing, and the woman was very beautiful to behold. So David sent and inquired about the woman. And someone said, "Is this not Bathsheba, the daughter of Eliam, the wife of Uriah the Hittite?" So at this point in the story, you have nothing about adultery. There's no need to plan a cover up for murder. Note that this occurred. But you have certain elements here required to commit the initial sin of coveting. And it's that David saw she was beautiful to hold. You could say he saw that she was something to be desired, right? Kind of like Eve. She saw the fruit. It was something to be desired, right? And what else did David find out? Well, he finds out the very first thing they wanted to warn him, she is another man's wife. At this point, he knows his desire has left the righteous confines. He should avert it, repent from it. This is another sovereign being's person they have a claim to. David does not. But you know what? He goes ahead with it. And he entertains those thoughts. And that violation led to adultery, murder, theft, a cover up, and eventually judgment and the further death of his own son. Right now, I'm about to take this in a direction that's not obvious, and I'm going to tease it just a little bit. You may be initially stunned, so I just want you to brace yourself. But in the modern age, everything has gotten way more efficient, right? We've developed software, algorithms, apps, machinery to make work so much easier and lighter, to where things that used to take 3 weeks to complete take mere seconds with AI, right? Coveting has always been one of Satan's most effective tools. And mankind has come along and developed a system to make the tool of covetousness so efficient and effective to implement. And that system is called Marxism. So, to define Marxism a little bit, it's typically spoken of in political and economic terms, and you may have heard something like the right of the workers to own the means of production. So let me tell you what that really is. All right, Marxism is a system meant to implement envy and induce covetousness, to incite it. All right, historically, the first one accredited with using the system to start an envy-induced riot called lovingly by communists a revolution, which is really just a murdering spree and a theft spree. This first person was Lenin, not John, but Vladimir. And he used the system to stir up the Bolsheviks, causing them to murder and take all the property of the bourgeoisie. All right, promising them that if they did this, they would have a fair and equal society, that they were oppressed and taken advantage of by these bourgeoisie, and that they deserved to own the means of production and share in a greater portion of the profits. Now, the envy couldn't be turned off though. And the system was never really about making things fair, but it was a tool implemented to get Vladimir into power, which when it happened, it led to somewhere between 100 and 600,000 brutal executions. No trial, no justice, and this was called the Red Terror. And between the Red Terror and the Civil War and mass starvation caused by central planning, there was about a 12 million person death toll, about 9% of the Russian population. And I could keep going with Marxist revolutionaries and tell you about, Pol Pot in Cambodia, Mao in China. But let me just touch on one that you all know of very well, uh, known as the Austrian painter or Adolf Hitler, right? And he used the same techniques, but they weren't about seizing the means of production, right? His argument was that the Jews' positions in wealth were at the expense of the Germans. And since he claimed that they were an inferior race, they would be doing the world a favor by exterminating them and taking all of their stuff to fund essentially a European, potentially a global takeover. Now, 20th century Marxism was known by its ability to convince one group of people to kill another and take their stuff. Right? America was actually at certain times, probably through the 50s and 60s, sort of becoming enamored with the Stalin regime. Stalin was Lenin's successor until a book written by one of the Russian Gulag survivors named Alexander Solzhenitsyn. It reached the American shores and it became widely read throughout the 70s, and it started dismantling the romanticization of socialism in America academia. And it helped really Americans realize what systemic envy does to a culture on the individual level. All right, but Lenin wasn't the first Marxist revolutionary. It was actually Korok, and he wound up about 250 Levites to oppose Moses and take his power so that it would be more fair and equal. And he even tried to sell Moses into giving up his power, you know, giving a slightly different version to Moses. Well, you take too much on yourself. We're all holy. We're all, of the tribe of Levi. You shouldn't have this power alone. It needs to be spread out. But the actual first Marxist revolutionary was the Satan, right? And in his revolution, he turned about 1/3 of the angels against Yah, and they were expelled from the heavenly realm. Now, let me get into how it works. So, what they do first is find a target. They're going to convince the target that they're oppressed, that this target deserves, they have a right to what their, supposed oppressor has or has denied them. You can kind of think of Eve being sold the idea that, God has in some way oppressed her by bogarting this special knowledge and that she should be equal to him. All right, then they develop the desire within this, I'm doing quotes here, oppressed person to take or steal what they now believe they deserve. They are going to, the Marxist is going to agitate it using lies and false logic. And then eventually they ride this wave of destruction into power. But it never turns out well for the society because the covetous people often die from starvation, forced labor, which is slavery, and a police state that constantly throws them in jail. Now, have You ever known a total narcissist? Um, Fostering envy and covetousness turns a person into a narcissist, right? And this is ultimately why I think socialism tends to fail every single time, because a society of narcissists, in that society, every person becomes a habitual liar, habitual thief. They become self centered. They only care about what they can get out of the situation. And most of them would sell their grandmother for a piece of bread. And many did. Many actually did during some of the Marxist revolutions and the societies that followed them. All right. But what to do about it? All right. So I think you have to recognize it in the culture. Recognize it in the culture and in the language and develop a response to it, right? To respond, you have to recognize it first, right? Certain words are going to be understood as, coming from this Marxist ideology. You'll hear things like fair share, right? And not always, but, if it's coming from a Democrat, it's they're employing Marxist rhetoric. You'll hear things like, oh, well, these people deserve their fair share, or, the top 1% need to pay their fair share. And fair share is usually a dead giveaway. They're always trying to um, sell someone else's money or power to uneducated people that didn't earn things but want them. And it's almost always to buy votes or ride their Marxist promises of fairness into power. Envy and covetousness are Marxism at the individual level, right? Instead of a revolutionary preaching and inspiring, conquest of some corporate desire, your own evil inclination speaks to you about conquest of an individual desire, and almost always at another person's expense. So you need to recognize it in yourself. It's there, right? You have to refute the evil inclination. And the best way to do that is through scripture. So knowing the Torah to bring yourself back in line. I think that especially in Western culture, we've been soaked in the idea of fairness, complaining about inequality. But honestly, if we got what we deserved, we would be nailed to a cross. But our Messiah took that for us to atone for us. As Isaiah says, he was beaten and bruised for our transgressions, right? So don't want what you deserve, because you deserve far worse than you have. All right. Also, what to do about it? Respect individual sovereignty, right? If it's your wife, lust after her. If it's your stuff, enjoy it. Be happy and content. If it's someone else's stuff, you have no business daydreaming about it. Congratulate them and move on, right? This is where love your neighbor as yourself really starts to fit in. Each person thinks of themselves as a sovereign individual, but they need to consider their neighbor's sovereignty just as important as their own. Don't think about their stuff or their wife or their position in certain ways, only because it's theirs and it's not mine or not yours. Right? The foundation of all coveting essentially starts with pride. A person thinking that they deserve another person's possession or position. And they have to build themselves into the frame of mind that always starts with the basis of all sins, which is pride. And of course, the cure for that is developing humility. All right, so in summary, all right, We talked about how covetousness relates to the other commands on the second tablet. It's often the initiator of more outward violations, and it's intrinsic to loving your neighbor. Satan, remember, he got Eve to desire Yah's position and knowledge, which led to theft, and then the food violation also followed. We talked about Marxism, a system to induce covetousness. It's responsible for 100 million deaths. That's a conservative estimate, just in the last 100 years. And it can be applied individually, like in the case of Eve, or, corporately in the case of Korach. And it convinces a target of oppression and how to regain fairness. And we talked about what to do about it. You've got to evaluate what you hear and what you think. It's very instrumental to respect another's sovereignty. And then, of course, pursuing humility can prevent all of this. All right, and with that, I hope you have learned something, from comparing the commandments, from looking at things historically, that this can make some sort of impact in your life, that we can affect ourselves individually and also corporately to, guide those around us away from coveting and more towards loving our neighbor.